So we're going to deal with some of the social aspects and some of the changes that we saw in the 1920s. And one of those certainly has to do with women. So women were given the right to vote after World War I. And there were some definite movements in the 1920s by women who increasingly wanted equal rights, not just the right to vote, but equality across the board. So we saw some pretty progressive things happening with women. Margaret Sanger was the founder of Planned Parenthood, and of course she was an vocal advocate for birth control and birth control rights for women. We also see the establishment of the National Women's Party, which calls for an equal rights amendment. Now that call started in the 1920s. It would regain a lot of headroom in the 1970s. And then we still have not seen an equal rights amendment today. The ERA has never been passed for women. But there's good and bad with that. You know, you pass an equal rights amendment, yes, equal rights are expected to be respected, but it also means going off to war and being in the front lines and so forth, which is, and being open to the draft, which is where women are today, except that we are not registered for the draft, but we are seeing movement so that women are going on the front lines and so forth in battle. There was a sexual revolution that went on in the 1920s. Women were really sort of feeling their independence and their freedom, and they took full advantage of that. You saw the flappers emerge with the shorter dresses and the fringe and the exposed shoulders in a lot of cases, the little feathered hats instead of the big dowdy things. You saw women smoking in public and drinking in public, well, as much as they could, prohibition. You saw women dancing in a pretty evocative way compared to the way they used to dance. You saw women flirting a lot with men and in a more open and aggressive way than you had seen before. Times were definitely a-changing. There used to be a time when a kiss meant a proposal of marriage. That was no longer the case. Now, kids were necking in the back of cars. Automobiles became known as houses of prostitution on wheels. So it really, the sexual revolution of the time really expounded and grew. Dr. Freud, of course, emerges. He's from Vienna, Austria. He's a psychologist. And he basically says that sexual repression, if you repress your sexual feelings, then you will have emotional and social ills that plague you. So he certainly is all for putting it out there. So then we have jazz and the Harlem Renaissance. And these sort of go hand in hand because you see a lot of African Americans involved in both of these movements, particularly the Harlem Renaissance. That was an African American movement. But jazz really comes from these great harmonies and melodies that they're putting together in New Orleans. And it comes out of New Orleans and it travels to the north, and jazz just expands all over the nation. What a beautiful sound jazz is. And that wasn't restricted to just African American musicians. There were a lot of white musicians involved in that movement as well. You had Handy Jelly Roll Morton, Joe King Oliver, two of your really famous jazz musicians at the time. Benny Goodman, of course, on that trumpet. Fantastic stuff going on. As far as the Harlem Renaissance went, there were 100,000 African Americans living in Harlem, New York. It was the biggest congregation outside of Africa of African Americans in any city. So it was fantastic. And you see a lot of art, music, literature evolve out of that Harlem Renaissance. It was a new way of learning. It was a new inspiration for the African Americans to really take advantage of. And one of the most famous poets of the time was a guy named Langston Hughes. Writes beautiful poetry, really inspiring stuff. He's probably the most famous man to emerge from the Harlem Renaissance. Then you had the emergence of an African-American man named Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey founds the United Negro Improvement Association, UNIA. And what that calls for is a relocation of African Americans back to Africa. So it was this whole back to Africa movement. It never really took off. There were some that took advantage of it, but not a whole lot. So it never really got its feet under it to get moving. Literary movements in the 1920s, huge, okay? So we're coming out of World War I. People are really they really feel society is disingenuous. They feel it's not, that they're really sort of blocking those horrid memories of World War I, and we have what was called the lost generation. This was this group of writers who really sort of had to go find themselves and find their voice again, and they wrote in a way that was completely new and different to what we had seen before. A lot of these guys would go to Europe to try and find that voice again. They were American writers, but they went to Europe and traveled quite a bit. So you have the emergence here of F. Scott Fitzgerald. You guys all know F. Scott Fitzgerald because I believe you've read The Great Gatsby at this point. And so he writes The Great Gatsby, which you know is a sort of portrayal of 1920s life. He also writes This Side of Paradise. Theodore Dreiser writes An American Tragedy, okay, sort of a reflection on the war and the post-war efforts. Ernest Hemingway emerges here, one of our best writers ever, emerges, and he writes The Sun Also Rises and Farewell to Arms. He writes a lot of other works too, but A Farewell to Arms was a look at World War I, and he was part of this lost generation. He actually moved to France for several years and lived there to sort of get reconnected with his literary soul. What we see in literature at the time is that authors are not afraid to get in touch with their beliefs and their feelings and put them on paper and put them in their stories. And writing becomes much more personal in the 1920s, which was very cool. Then we have Wall Street. So this is just sort of a prelude to what's coming. So Wall Street in the 1920s, incomes are definitely up. People are making more money than they'd ever made before. The stock market goes up and up and up. It just seems like there's no end in sight for how high Wall Street can go. So it's a very bullish economy, okay? You have the bulls and the bears. This was bullish. This was a good economy. But there were some signs of trouble starting in the 1920s that if people had been really astute, they would have realized that something is amiss here. Something's going to happen. The bubble's going to burst. You had some banks that were failing in the 1920s because they had given bad loans that weren't being paid back, particularly to farmers. You also have, and of course the farmers are the first to feel the Great Depression because they never really become prosperous in the 1920s because after the war they can't sell all of their crops, and they have all this new equipment that they had to buy and pay for. And so their loans on that equipment are going bust, and that's why the banks are failing, over-speculated in farming loans. There was also some real estate speculation that went bad, particularly in Florida. There were these huge land deals made in Florida, and people bought all this land thinking that it would be great for vacations and resorts and so forth. It is, today still is. Look at Walt Disney World, wow. To own that land would have been fantastic. So, but back in the 1920s, people were buying this land sight unseen. They didn't know what the land looked like, and it turned out that all this land that they were buying was basically swamps. Not good for your pocketbook. So you can't really sell that afterwards. And there were people, a lot of investors who were buying stocks on margin. So what does that mean? On margin means that you pay for a percentage of the stocks you want, but you buy the rest and you sort of gamble that those stocks are going to make money, and when you sell, you'll make a nice profit and you'll pay back whoever's holding the rest of that stock. So you sort of take a loan out to buy the stock, but then you have to pay the loan back. Well, that worked for the first couple of years in the 1920s. It does not work closer to the Depression, when stocks start going down, and we see our couple of Black Tuesday, Black Fridays in October of 1929. All of a sudden, people are like, "Oh, my stock went down. Now I don't have the money to cover the loans I took out to buy that stock." So when you buy on margin, you're basically buying on credit, and that's never a good way to invest. National debt. The national debt soars in the 1920s. It's pretty bad, and of course not as bad as today, but the national debt goes up, up, up. So the Republicans in Congress create what's called the Bureau of the Budget, and the job of the Bureau of the Budget is to really monitor the budget closely. You gotta wonder if we still have that today. And then the Secretary of the Treasury was a guy named Andrew Mellon. You may have heard of him. He's the namesake for Mellon Bank, Carnegie Mellon University. That's Andrew Mellon. He was in charge of the economy at the time, and he believed that it shouldn't be up to the rich to pay the tax burden, that they had been overtaxed for years. So he changes the tax rate in this country so that the tax burden is shifted from the rich, who were taking their money and investing it in tax-free securities rather than creating jobs with it and opening up businesses. He takes that tax burden and he shifts it to the middle class, because the middle class isn't going to, if they're overtaxed, they're overtaxed. They don't have the kind of money to go put in tax-free securities somewhere offshore. But the rich did. And there are some arguments that say that, yes, this works. Today, we still sort of run on this premise. There's still that sort of dividing line. The Democrats believe that the tax burden should be on the rich because they make more money, but the Republicans say if you overtax the rich, they can't invest in businesses and create jobs. And, with our economy the way it is, we need job creation. So this gets very tricky as far as who the tax burden should go to.